While I was in Kansas, I purchased a weekly newspaper, the Claybank Thundergust of Reform. This paper had never paid its expenses. It had ruined 4 consecutive publishers, but my brother-in-law, Mr. Jefferson Scandrell of Wheathaven, was going to run for the legislature, and I naturally desired his defeat. So it became necessary to have an organ in Claybank to assist in his political extinction. When the establishment came into my hands, the editor was a fellow who had opinions, and him and I once discharged with admonition. I had some difficulty in procuring a successor. Every man in the county applied for the place. I could not appoint one without having to fight a majority of the others, and was eventually compelled to write to a friend at Warm Springs in the adjoining state of Missouri to send me an editor from abroad whose installment at the helm of Manifest Destiny would have no local significance. The man he sent me was a frowsy, seedy fellow named Masthead, not larger, apparently, than a boy of 16 years, though it was difficult to say from the outside how much of him was editor and how much was cast-off clothing. For in the matter of apparel, he had acted upon his favorite professional maxim, and sunk the individual. His attire, eminently eclectic and in a sense of international, quite overcame him at all points. However, as my friend had assured me, he was a graduate of one of the largest institutes in his native state. I took him in and bought a pen for him. My instructions to him were brief and simple. "Mr. Masthead," said I, "it is the policy of the Thundergust, first, last, and all the time, in this world and the next, to resent the intrusion of Mr. Jefferson Scandrell into politics." The first thing the little rascal did was to write a withering leader denouncing Mr. Scandrell as a demagogue, the degradation of whose political opinions was only equated by the disgustfulness of the family connections of which those opinions were the spawn. I hastened to point out to Mr. Masthead that it had never been the policy of the Thundergust to attack the family relations of an offensive candidate, although this was not strictly true. "I am very sorry," he replied, running his head out of his clothing until it towered as much as 6 inches above the table at which he sat. "No offense, I hope." "Oh, none in the world," said I, as carelessly as I could manage it. "Only I don't think that is an effective method of attack." "Mr. Johnson," said he. I was passing as Johnson at that time, I remember. "Mr. Johnson, I think it is an effective method. Personally, I might perhaps prefer another line of argument in this particular case, and personally, perhaps you might, but in our profession, personal considerations must be blown in the winds of the horizon. We must sink the individual. In opposing the election of your relative, sir, you have set the seal of your heavy displeasure upon the sin of nepotism, and for this I respect you. Nepotism must not be got under. But in the display of Roman virtue, sir, we must go the whole hog, but in the interest of public morality." Mr. Masthead was now gesticulating earnestly with the sleeves of his coat. Virginia stabbed his daughter. Was he influenced by personal considerations? When Curtius leaped into the yawning gulf, did he not sink the individual? I admitted that he did, but feeling in a contentious mood, prolonged the discussion by leisurely loading and capping a revolver. The prescient of my argument, Mr. Masthead avoided refutation by hastily adjourning the debate. I sent him a note that evening, filling in a few of the details of the policy that I had before sketched in outline. Amongst other things, I submitted that it would be better for us to exalt Mr. Scandrell's opponent than degrade himself. To this Mr. Masthead reluctantly assented, sinking the individual, he reproachfully explained, in the dependent employee, the powerless bondsman. The next issue of the Thundergust contained, under the heading "Invigorating Zephyrs," the following editorial article. "Last week we declared our unalterable position to the candidacy of Mr. Jefferson Scandrell, and gave reasons for the faith that is in us. For the first time in its history, this paper made a clear, thoughtful, and adequate avowal of exposition of eternal principle. Abandoning for the present the stand we then took, let us trace the antecedents of Mr. Scandrell's opponent up to their source. It has been urged against Mr. Broskin that he spent some years of his life in the lunatic asylum at Warm Springs and the adjoining Commonwealth of Missouri. This cuckoo cry, raised though it is by dogs of political darkness, we shall not stoop to controvert, for it is accidentally true. But next week we shall show, as by the stroke of an enchanter's wand, that this great statesman's detractors would probably not derive any benefit from a residence in the same institution, their mental aberration being rottenly incurable. I thought this rather strong and not quite to the point, but Masthead said it was the fact that our candidate, who was very little known in Claybank, had served a term in the Warm Springs Asylum, and the issue must be boldly met. That evasion and denial were but forms of prostration beneath the iron wheels of truth. As he said this, he seemed to inflate and expand so as almost to fill his clothes, and the fire of his eye somehow burned into me an impression, since effaced, that a just cause is not imperiled by a trifling concession to fact. So, leaving the matter quite in my editor's hands, I went away to keep some important engagements. The paragraph having involved me in several duels with the friends of Mr. Broskin, I thought it rather hard that I should have to defend my new editor's policy against the supporters of my own candidate, particularly as I was clearly in the right and they knew nothing whatsoever about the matter in dispute, not one of them having ever before so much as heard of the now famous Warm Springs Asylum. But I would not shirk even the humblest journalistic duty. I fought these fellows and acquitted myself as became a man of letters and a politician. The hurts I got were sometime healing, and in the interval every prominent member of my party who came to Claybank to speak to the people regarded it as a simple duty to call first at my house, make it a tender inquiry as to the progress of my recovery, and leave a challenge. My physician forbade me to read a line of anything. The consequence was that Mr. Masthead had it all his own way with the paper. And looking over the old files now, I find that he devoted his entire talent, and all the space of the paper, including what had been the advertising columns, to confessing that our candidate had been an inmate in a lunatic asylum, and contemptuously asking the opposing party what they were going to do about it. All this time Mr. Broskin made no sign, but when the challenges became intolerable, I indignantly instructed Mr. Masthead to whip around the other side and support my brother-in-law. Masthead thanked the individual, and duly announced, with his accustomed frankness, our change of policy. Then Mr. Broskin came down to Claybank to thank me. He was a fine, respectable-looking gentleman, and impressed me very favorably. But Masthead was in when he called, and the effect upon him was different. He shrank into a mere heap of old clothes, turned white, and chattered to his teeth. Noting this extraordinary behavior, I at once sought an explanation. "Mr. Broskin," said I with a meaning glance at the trembling editor, "from certain indications I am led to fear that owing to some mistake we may have been doing you an injustice. May I ask you if you were really ever in the lunatic asylum at Warm Springs, Missouri?" "For 3 years," he replied quietly. "I was the physician in charge of that institution." "Your son," turning to Masthead, who was flying all sorts of colors, "was, if I mistake not, one of my patients. I learned that a few weeks ago a friend of yours, named Norton, secured the young man's release upon your promise to take care of him yourself in future. I hope that home associations have improved the poor fellow. It's very sad." It was indeed. Norton was the name of the man to whom I had written for an editor, and who had sent me one. Norton was ever an obliging fellow.